would you please check your ideas and opinions at the door? All your philosophical and religious views, all your logic, because I say check it at the door advisedly because you can pick it up again when you go out if you feel unsafe without it. I'm not trying to argue you out of your opinions and views. I'm merely suggesting that for the sake of an experiment, you temporarily suspend them.
Hello and welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric, from the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all. Join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter, and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. If you enjoy the show and find it of value, consider supporting and becoming a patron via the Patreon at patreon.com/philosophicalminds. A small contribution makes a big difference and definitely makes it easier for me to continue the show, although I will always do my best to keep it flowing regardless. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right, I'm here tonight with founder and director of the Institute of Hermetic Studies, Western esoteric educator, prolific author, and speaker, Mark Stavish. Mark, thank you for being here tonight.
Oh, I thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So let's get into it, shall we? I recently have been sort of revisiting the Corpus Hermeticum, and I thought it'd be interesting to hear your perspective in particular on matters related to Hermes, as well as the Divine Pymander, Pomanders. I'm not really exactly sure how you pronounce that. So I'm kind of trying to sort some things out, and I'm grateful just to be able to talk to you about this because I think you're the perfect person to kind of ask some of these questions. But first, if you allow me to, just for a minute, to kind of lay the foundation and context, and then once I do so, I'll hand it over to you to kind of correct anything if you feel that I've misspoken, or just give me your thoughts. But I'm going to kind of lay out some key aspects as far as I understand. So there are many potentialities and directions to go with Hermes, obviously. There's like the general interpretation of Hermes as Thoth, or as being responsible essentially for the transmission of things like writing itself, the Hermetic arts, and so on. Some believe strictly in the archetypal level, acting through scribes. Others include subscribing to the notion of a physical embodiment in Egypt, perhaps as Thoth. And then there's some interesting corresponding philosophical notions within alchemy, with Mercury being related to the spirit or the menstruum of things, and then him kind of acting as that divine messenger that would essentially act as a fiery, active, hermaphroditic courier force between the body and the soul, and or the great amalgamator in the metallic sense. And then Hermes was said to be a psychopump, to use the Greek terminology, or soul guide, or spirit conductor, or conductor of souls into the afterlife. And some would view Hermes as an intermediary bridge or messenger between the individual and the mind of God itself. Some associate Hermes with the mind alone. And I'm curious, firstly, to know what your personal overall assessment is of Hermes. If someone simply comes to you and asks, who or what is Hermes, how would you respond?
Well, it's all of those things you've mentioned, and therein lies the rub. You know, whenever we look at an alchemical text, or even Kabbalistic text for that matter, but alchemical text, we see terms that are used, and they're often used in very different ways. So the same word can have several different meanings. One of the problems that we have is we have come to take words very much at their face value, quite literally. And that may simply be the nature of English, because so much of us, when we have these discussions, or English is our first language, and that's what we're referring to, English translations of things. And very often when we're trying to translate something for a popular audience, footnotes or endnotes that further elaborate on the subtlety of meaning either are ignored or often discouraged, and so they're absent. When we look at the notion of Thoth, we see even within the Egyptian mythologies, there are many aspects to it. There's even one aspect where he's a creator god. So he can be a kind of supreme being. We have him as the recorder of the words of Thoth, the architect god, behind me over here. Okay. So we have then, of course, Thoth, or as we understand it, as an expression of Mercury, the Greek god Mercury, that is. Curious. So, or Hermes, excuse me, the Roman god Mercury, the Greek god Hermes. So we have this amalgamation of ideas. And then when going from text to text, we have to make sure that we keep it contextual. That's further problematic because if you look at any text or any system, it will often have a minimum of 4 levels of understanding. And you see this in the classical period. The church fathers were quite clear about the 4 different levels of scripture. And we see this in many traditions, so it's not uncommon. So when we say is Thoth or Hermes my own self, of course it is. And when we read the Corpus Hermeticum, we're reading a conversation. A conversation between Hermes and a young protege. So we are both parties in that text. And that is a common way of writing. We see that style of communicating ideas was fairly common in many cultures. I mean, within the framework of the Middle East and what we'd call India into Tibet and China, that conversational approach was used quite often. So was Thoth a human being who was deified? I can't answer that. The story suggests that may be the case, but that wouldn't change the possibility of Thoth being some kind of name given to a supreme being or force within the Egyptian experience. And this is a very important question today, because we see the question in many esoteric circles, particularly those involved in operative magic, is, are the beings, angels, demons, gods, demigods, are they real independent beings and forces? Are they separate from us? Or are they always just a projection of our own potentiality from our own unconscious? And I believe that that question is an interesting one. It shows how far we have strayed from the classical view, where in the classical traditions, there would have been no question that these were independent forces. But at the same time, as one interacted with them, one took on their characteristics and therefore became like them. Hence, we see the notion of becoming the children of Hermes, or the sons and daughters of Hermes, because our own deification was part of that theurgic process. It says within the Corpus Hermeticum that if you wish to be a god, you can become one. Overcome all limitations. The ultimate Hermetic practice is really simply that of identification. That which we identify with, we become like. And that's clearly stated in the text. And with that, a series of what we might consider exercises or meditational points are given. Consider yourself beyond death, consider yourself beyond the grave, consider yourself in the womb, consider yourself young, consider yourself old, consider all this at the same time. Hold all of this in your mind. And don't have any self-pity. Don't have any, oh, I can't do this, I can't do that. That's considered the greatest sin, if we can use that word. The great sin is that of self-deprecation, not humility, not genuine, sincere effort of trying and working, but that kind of, oh, who am I? I can't do this. And it even says very clearly, if you shut yourself up and say, I can't do this, I can't do that, then how can you know God? So one develops what we would consider, or what is probably poorly translated from the tantric text, this sense of a divine pride, or cultivating that divine identification, which we think of in modern terms, often use the term assumption of the God form. We are taking on the characteristics of the deity. So is Hermes all these things? Of course, because Hermes can be anything Hermes wants to be. And therein lies probably one of the greatest problems that we see in modern occult. I don't use the word esoteric, I use the word occult teachings, particularly the magical ones coming out of the Golden Dawn, the British schools in particular, and that of with Dion Fortune, is one, a somewhat heavy emphasis on the psychological aspect without enough balancing out of the when I say transpersonal, I mean even beyond that of individuality, kind of a super deific force. We don't see much discussion of that. But at the same time, we see this notion of the deities fitting into these very neat little pigeonholes within the spheres on the tree of life. Hod is Thoth. Well, yeah, but so-and-so said Hokmah was. No, they're wrong. That's a blind, meant to fool the uninitiated, and that kind of nonsense. So we see that these characteristics are vast, and we have to be very careful that when we start out using a system like that, that we have to remember that's the tree of life, and all of these systems are very, very good beginnings. When you want to go on a journey, it's nice to have a map and have an idea as to where you're going and have different route options on how to get there. But it's a very poor end. Once you get there, you stop looking at the map. So when we look at these tables of correspondences, students often get very confused, particularly if you look at tables of correspondences, say from the 3 books of occult philosophy, compared to the Picatrix, and then compared to maybe, 2 or 3 other texts. There'll be similarities, but there can often be considerable differences. So we have to look at what is the function or nature of the deity in the story that we're looking at, because the story is part of the teaching mechanism. One of the things we don't have in contemporary magical circles, and by that I mean mostly those derived from the Golden Dawn, and I'm not bashing, I'm just saying because it's the most common, it's the most well known. There are other examples too, is a firm philosophical view as a foundation. It's not there, it doesn't exist. Like you would find in, say, and to give an example, of course, would be maybe Tantras or Vajrayana. You don't have that firm philosophical foundation, but that firm philosophical foundation did exist in the Renaissance, magical systems. So, and of course, in the classical ones, it was built into the story. So we have to look at function. What is the story about? What is the story trying to tell us? And then we understand the role that the deity is playing in that story. And it's very similar to what you would see in later morality plays, or in a very different but similar fashion, initiatic rituals and high degree masonry, because those are done in that same style of the morality play. That's why I give that example. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. And in relation to the Divine Pymander in particular, how do you pronounce? Do you pronounce that like Pymander or Pymander? Is it just potato type thing, or?
What I do is I go on Google and I Google search pronunciation for every word. One of the funniest things was, when I was doing my book on egregores, the joke was, well, how do you pronounce it? Because there's a really particular way. And I said, well, of course, we anglicize it or Americanize it when we pronounce it. And when we were doing the audiobook, of course, the more tired my mouth got, the harder it was to say things. And we get to a lot of words that we'd written out or typed, but we never heard pronounced. And of course, we get to some of them in French or something, which of course is always tricky for some folks. And the studio producer, the fellow who's in the studio with me, he would have in my headphone, they were always channeling in, whatever Google said, how do you pronounce whatever, whatever the word was, because at some point, everything just goes on you. So I always say, I will sidestep that direct answer and say, let Google be your friend, and argue that out with someone else on proper pronunciation of words, because I think we have a problem there with scholarship too. Many of us are not properly trained. I was fortunate. I do have a degree in theology and a degree in counseling, but one has to have a certain scholarly approach to this work without necessarily being a scholar. And we see that. What do we mean by that? Is by just having a good head on your shoulders. And that means just use the resources available to you to find out what you need.
Okay. And so with I'm just gonna say Pymander. Could you speak to what the Divine Pymander represents in the context of the conversation between Hermes and the Divine Pymander?
Well, as I said, when I go through the text, and I believe this is the one which I use most often here. That is okay. The Way of Hermes, Inner Traditions. Okay. And then, of course, I always enjoy the Thrice Great Hermes by Mead. Mead is a very sympathetic read if you're looking for really a spiritual perspective on it. He really provides great insight there. What I see as the common theme throughout the text is that which you identify with, you become. And that there is this cosmos that you exist in. And there's a description of that cosmos and the different planetary energies and different beings that live there. It's a very thin description, but that we as individuals, as human beings, are seeking to deal with what it calls necessity and fate. And how do we grow in this process? And in that process of overcoming is deification. That same approach is it's called ascent. The process of ascent. How do we ascend? Now, of course, the question is, are we actually ascending? Are we moving in an upward direction? I mean, there's that feeling of expansion, so that probably gives a feeling of ascent. But what does that truly mean? And we would call it, that is our awakening, that is our illumination, that is our apotheosis, our divine, our divination. So it's a series of instructions on the path of where we are, where we're going, and again, what we need to do to get there. And that's made very clear about in terms of what you're to meditate on and imagine. They use the word imagination. And to practice, and what you're to avoid. There's vices you're to avoid because they drag you down. But of course, the one made most clear is self-pity and doubt. If you shut yourself up and say, I cannot do these things, I cannot ascend to heaven, I cannot do any of this, then what can you know of God? And this needs to be, that's really a key focal point of the whole text, which is very small, by the way.
Okay. And so you had mentioned you have the Mead translation. I think the one I recently got, it was John Everard. Do you have any opinion on translators, and is there much of a difference between texts? I don't have a variety of them or anything, but I'm curious as far as your opinion goes. Would you value one more so than the other? Is the message pretty much the same, or?
Well, it depends on what you're after. If we go with Mead, of course, was a theosophist as well as a scholar of the time, an early student of comparative religions and cultures. So he brings to his commentary a profound spiritual sympathy that you don't have in modern academic text. You know, he's bringing not only the sympathy of the view, the philosophical view, which I said is very important, but he also is bringing his own experiences. You know, his own inner experiences are guiding him in many ways in not only the choice of text to translate, but also his understanding of their importance to us today. I mean, this stuff has been around. I don't know what the date on this is, but it's at least been around for 100 years or somewhere around there. So it's that says quite a bit. Now, will this translation by Inner Traditions from these folks be around in 100 years? I don't know. I mean, I think it's a good book. I enjoy it. But of course, I've seen some scholarly discussions about whose version is better and why. I'm not too terribly concerned about that, because what I have found is, even though there can be tremendous benefit, and I mean this seriously, tremendous benefit from very good scholarly translations, at the end of the day, you're going to have to reconcile the differences. I mean, I have several, I think 3 copies of this. I also have 3 copies of the Orphic hymns. And I can open them up and I'll look at them and read one, read the other, and they're the same hymn, but there's differences in how the translator perceives it. So what I do, because I'm not concerned about some perceived scholarly accuracy, I'm concerned about the value of an experience. I find a way to reconcile these differences, which I may create my own 4th translation by combining these 3. And we see that happen all the time. And you know, as a practitioner, that's a valid approach. Although I've seen people, just scholars, get very upset about that. Well, look at, you've got 3 different texts, 3 people who all know ancient Greek, and yet we have 3 different, not terribly different, but uniquely different translations in some points. So you're going to have to internalize this.
I like the idea of, I mean, just reading them all and cross-referencing that information and kind of deciding, you know, reading between the lines and figuring out for yourself kind of what comes through. And
well, ultimately you have to.
Right. Yeah. And earlier you were mentioning, in regards to, I guess, anything, you'd said with the biblical scriptures as well, you were talking about those 4 layers or levels of interpretation. Could you elaborate on what those are? Sure,
and it's pretty straightforward. And we talk about this, you know, at the Institute for Hermetic Studies. This is outlined in our course, Unfolding the Rose, which anyone can sign up for. It's free, so listeners can just go to the Teachable and get a membership at Teachable, which is free. They just sign in, and then they can go to the Institute for Hermetic Studies and sign up for Unfolding the Rose. You know, those 4 levels generally look at something in terms of, one is what we think of as exoteric or outer, and for the most part that is going to be a historical understanding of the story of the text. Okay. Now, clearly, this makes some texts harder to appreciate than others, because how do we take something like Genesis and the creation aspect and put it in a historical context? And there are some Kabbalists who will say that, what is it, so many 6,000 and so many years ago, on Saturday at 6 a.m. in the morning, the world was created. I've seen that. I've seen another one where it's put on a different day. but you get the idea. Okay, sure. Now, of course, behind that is symbolism. Why Saturday? Because it has to do with Saturn. And why 6 a.m.? Because that, in theory, would be the beginning of the day of sunrise. You understand? And then, of course, folks can drive themselves to the edge of insanity doing as much gematria and notaricon as they wish on it.
Definitely.
So we have first and foremost the historical understanding. Now, with that historical will be a stated or implied morality tale, a moral lesson. So when it says, the 10 Commandments, don't murder, that's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of symbolism behind that. It's don't first and foremost murder. And one of the reasons why is in that environment, things would quickly turn into the Hatfields and McCoys. No? These ideas are to keep social order in many regards, and that's necessary and essential. Well, once that's done, we can then look at, well, okay, I'm not a murderer. I'm not going to murder anyone. And, some say don't kill. And that, of course, how you read that decides, well, of course they were killing all the time. They were killing to eat. So, they meant don't kill people. What do they mean don't kill people? Their neighbors over the hill are going to come with, spears and swords, and springtime is wartime. It's planting, but it's war. So, what do we mean? Well, it's really don't murder. But, okay, I'm not going to do that. So what does it mean too? Well, then to kill or to murder can have other connotations. So there we get into kind of a religious mysticism. And it can be with anything. Probably some of the greatest examples of religious mysticism are found within the Catholic tradition. And we have St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa, we have Hildegard von Bingen, we have Meister Eckhart, and others. And these people who had fantastic, very visionary experiences of the divine, of a direct personal relationship to their understanding of the divine. And from that religious mysticism, we see also then the movement into a kind of ascent or degrees of illumination. We would call that initiatic experiences. They're initiatic because these are progressive interior experiences. They're progressive. They build upon one another. They're interior. They have to do with you. They're not happening in the physical environment. That is, they may appear to be, but they're probably not. They're probably not an objective phenomena. Meaning that when we hear the story of Saul riding on his horse on the way to Damascus being struck down by light, that light was probably something that only he experienced. People around him, had they been there, probably would not have seen it. It was an interior experience, most likely. And it's progressive, interior experience. It's something you experience. You know it. There's no really ambiguity about the fact that it occurred, even if you don't fully understand what it was. So as they build upon one another, a series of awakenings take place, and we call it interior initiation. And we can see, of course, going back to St. Teresa or St. John, that these are often described in levels of 7, or in those cases, 10 steps or castles. So then we get up with different diagrams, and then people comment on the diagrams, and systems are built, and schools are organized around them. Maybe because of time and place, those are secret societies. Other times they're maybe cloaked more heavily in the religious culture of the period. But there we have an initiatic understanding, a revealed understanding that eventually becomes somewhat codified and passed down through lines of transmission. And again, they can be interior as well. Probably one of the most heavily codified books would be, the Gospel of, or excuse me, the Book of Revelations, the Apocalypse of John. A very heavy text. And it's really probably an initiatic text rather than a prophetic one. Although it could be. It may be all of those things too. Many people look at that text as merely a commentary and, the Roman era of that period as a political text rather than a religious one. Could be. Maybe it's all of those. So then we move beyond that and we move into something, sometimes the text is pretty direct. It's about a direct experience, which is really what we're after. The direct, unfiltered experience of the divine, and whatever that means, or of our inner self, of our inner revelation. So we have at least 4 levels that things can be looked at.
Okay. So historical, religious, initiatic, and experiential, essentially.
Your direct experience, unfiltered.
Direct, unfiltered. All right. And okay, so what is a liturgy and what is its function or intention? And I ask this in particular in regards to the Liturgy of Hermes. So yeah, that's the question.
A liturgy is a religious practice or work of the people, and it's something which you do. It is the same as a sadhana in Indian or Tibetan tantras. It's a practice. It's something you do. And liturgies can be very informal or very formal. We think of them mostly in the formal sense. A somewhat informal liturgical practice would be something like a rosary or a novena that is done for a period of days. Most people think of liturgy only in terms of church services, high church services, but that's a cultural phenomenon for us rather than anything else. The Liturgy of Hermes is a practice that is utilized within the Institute for Hermetic Studies, in which many people have done. Of course, not everyone, but many, we encourage it, which is a traditionally based practice to be done for about 42 days to help you orient your mind and awareness into the Hermetic current. And what that does is it helps you understand if this is the right path for you. I mean, if you're going to spend a lot of time studying something, and any of these spiritual practices often take about 2 to 3 years of practice, study and practice before you really understand, is this for me or not? It's not something that often happens just right off the bat at the get-go, so to speak. Oh, this is for me, and you stick with it. It takes a while to work yourself into it because there's things you have to learn, and of course things you need to experience. And that only happens with patience and practice. So the Liturgy of Hermes is an overview of the path with Thoth as its focal point, and the various aspects that Thoth presents that the individual participating in does to the best of their ability, once or twice a day for about 40 days at certain prescribed times. It can be done anytime, but certain times are a little better than others. Like springtime, early summer is a great time for it. And if all goes well, sometime during that period, they're going to have insight. Now, what that insight will be is difficult to say, but everyone I know who's undertaken it has said it was life-changing. And it was one of the few times when they really had to struggle. And it's not that it's hard. It's a very simple thing to do, but it forces us to make a concerted effort along our journey. And at that end of 7 weeks, when you're done, or 6 weeks, 42 days, many people will report similar experiences. I don't want to give it away, but it's very helpful. And even if you decide this is not the path for you, the discipline and the experience of having undertaken that will serve you in whatever path you take. That's the beauty of it. So it's a win-win for you all around.
There's some line within the Liturgy of Hermes that mentions the great Agatha daemon, the father of all gods. Where's this name derived or referenced historically? And could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Oh, the Agatha Daemon. I don't have the ritual in front of me. I don't have the text in front of me. I'd have to see it. But in this case, it's referring to our supreme personal deity, whether that is some aspect of our higher self, some projection of our own unconscious, or, as many systems suggest, an independent being that we have a relationship with to help assist us in our journey. This is what it's referring to. But the origin of the word, I mean, it's clearly Greek, but at what time it first came into use or being, I'd have to look that up.
Interesting. All right, so back to Hermes for a minute. Like, philosophically, would you relate Hermes in terms of the spirit and the soul, like within the 3 alchemical principles? Would you relate Hermes more so to the spirit or more so to the soul?
Well, therein lies the first problem. What do we mean by spirit and what do we mean by soul?
That was going to be my next question for you.
Yeah, so we have to define those first.
And how would you define those?
Depends on what text you're looking at in many ways.
Okay.
If we're looking at soul, we generally are referring to our consciousness, our awareness, which is all inclusive in that sense, not just the physical awareness or sensory awareness, which we're intimately aware of, but something that's all inclusive. When we talk about spirit, we're really talking about energy, literally energy, air, breath. Okay, the pneumatic aspect of things, which would be similar to the first principle of life, like prana, as we see in yoga. There's very similar, there are a lot of similarities in how they're used in the theurgic systems. So what is Hermes? Well, Thoth and Hermes appears in these texts to be the mind, something leading us to self-awareness. So it's like the higher self teaching the outer self. Here, pay attention to this, pay attention to this, pay attention to this. But if we want to plug that in somewhere and say, oh, this is spirit or soul, whatever I say is going to be wrong for someone. That's why, remember, we have to look at things very much within their own context. Which book are you using? Which school are you in? And try to keep it within that framework. And then say, okay, now if we look at something else, okay, are there similarities or differences? Yes, but we have to be very careful that we don't try to homogenize it too much.
Yeah, and I agree with you as far as my overall understanding is the spirit and the soul. But there was kind of one of the questions that I have been kind of contemplating on after looking at the Corpus Hermeticum again, because there's the section where Hermes is having a conversation with the divine mind in some sense, or the higher mind. And so it kind of made me wonder about that whole correspondence with the either the mind as soul, or some people would say the mind as related to spirit, but I would think it's more so soul as well. But so that was kind of just it was a little bit confusing for me. And do you see it as there's a lower mind and a higher mind of some sort?
Well, again, the problem here is when we look at things, we're often discussing it within our terms, which are within the framework of modern psychology. and occult psychology at that. So when we say lower or higher, what are we referring to? When we're talking about lower, we're talking about something which is narrower in scope, which is mainly focused and concerned with the sentient world, that is the sensory world, taking in information from the sensory world, processing that information, and then using it to move in the sensory world. So it has a fairly narrow scope of application, and it widens kind of like a funnel. It increases, and at some point it reaches different lines of transference or movement, and connects with what we think of as a higher mind. But between these two, there's a big gray zone. Okay. And we often then refer to that gray zone as ego, that is identity. What do I identify with? And then we refer to aspects of that gray zone in terms of the subconscious or the unconscious. What are those things we experience when we close our eyes or our mind drifts off when we go to sleep? And then, of course, what is beyond that? That's when we're talking about some clarity of direct perception of truth, if you want to call it that, a direct perception. And that's what we're often thinking of as higher mind. So it's a continuum. We have to think of this as a continuum rather than as discrete pockets or entities, which again, as I stated earlier regarding Kabbalah, is probably one of the major problems with how many students learn Kabbalah. They book learn on their own, and they read the text, and they tend to take it very concretely. The same thing with lower mind, higher mind, unconscious. Well, these are not discrete. They're more like eddies, in a stream. You look at that little whirlpool area, and that's a discrete ecosystem in its own way. But at the same time, it's connected to the larger framework of the river.
I like that analogy. And like within the context of the Corpus Hermeticum, when Hermes is having that conversation with the Divine Pymander, if you're to describe that in any level, the relationship between Hermes and the Divine Pymander, or I've heard it referred to also as the divine man shepherd. I don't know if that's
the man shepherd, the shepherd,
accurate.
Right? Shepherd of mind.
So in that context, would Hermes be represented as a lower level mind communicating with a higher level mind, or how would you describe what's going on there?
Well, again, that's the impression in that text, and I think we then have to look at the text and say that, are they discrete entities? Are they combined text over of different sources that are collated and put together? Because the relationship seems to shift around a little bit in them, as we stated. But throughout the text as a whole, when you're always looking at this communication, and the communication is designed to get us identifying with the characters because they're aspects of us, and expanding our self-awareness. And we do that through absorption in the text, meditative absorption, but also doing the things which it tells us to do. Like it says, when it says, imagine yourself as all these things, that's a direction. That in a paragraph that gives many of the meditative instructions that you would see in, the sutras of Patanjali. Meditate on this, meditate on that, meditate on this, except those are very short and brief aphorisms. Well, here it's in a paragraph. So it's doing this to help expand your mind. And what is mind? But, it's not just an intellectual construct, but it is a totality of awareness.
Well, I think it's pretty effective. Because it definitely makes you contemplate.
And contemplation is the first step, because without contemplation, you can't then have enough engagement with the material or the ideas to fall into, which is what we do, what we would call meditative absorption, where you're just completely absorbed in it.
Okay. All right. When one is doing any sort of like invocation, and or say you're doing things in proper fashion and with proper protective mechanisms in place and all, and you're calling upon individualized higher forces in order to facilitate like a proper energy channel for a more potent result or something along those lines, and whether it be Hermes or Saint Germain or whomever, what's preventing one from bypassing the quote unquote like smaller guys, so to speak, and going direct to source or direct to the general like principle of the divine architect, or the power that resides at the heart of creation itself, in your view? Is it available or achievable in that way? Or is that kind of just a simplified understanding, or are there other things to consider?
When we look at the different practices as presented by different schools, some do a very graded approach. Others do a more direct approach. And it depends on what the temperament and characteristics of the individual are, what your capacity is, what your philosophical understanding of yourself is. You know, that's going to decide the outcome, not the practice. The practice is the activity part of the philosophical view. So if you understand yourself to be a person who is capable of the direct experience, and you have enough experience to suggest that may be true, then something like New Thought, or as we said earlier, Raja Yoga, or certain aspects of Dzogchen, these would be ideal for you. It's you and whatever the highest is. Go there. Some people like this and they get a great deal out of it, but then they often wonder, well, what's the broader cosmology at work? And then we see some notions of, well, maps of the territory, as we said, like the Tree of Life and similar such things. And then people say, well, maybe I need to explore this map, see what these other territories are. What are these other levels of being? What are these other classes of beings that might be in there? What are these angels? What are these archangels? What are these demigods, these heroes, realms of the dead, hell realms, purgatory, all this stuff? What are these things? So if you're of the inclination to want to take that all in, then that's what you'll do. But you have to have the capacity for it. And that means, are you willing to make those friends along the way that can be your friend and guide? You know, such as like Dante, you know, where's your Virgil? Where's Virgil to guide you? You know, the vision of the Holy Guardian Angel takes place in Malkuth. Everyone emphasizes this knowledge and conversation part, which supposedly takes place in Tifereth for the Kabbalists out there, but you have to have the vision first. The vision in Malkuth to guide you. So, or at least inspire you. As some would say, and Paracelsus, and actually not Paracelsus, but Agrippa said that, you know, it's easier to communicate with the saints because they were men once, they understand us, and it is the gods. And there may be some truth to that. And I mean that quite honestly, that, you know, I wrote an essay years ago. It was the first time I used anything kind of vulgar in writing. And it wasn't terrible, but it was called Why Angels Can Be Douchebags. And it's a really popular essay because, of course, the title got a lot of attention and people laugh, and then they read it. And it says, you know, these beings have agendas of their own. Now, invisible beings, if they're sentient and exist, they have agendas of their own. They're not just hanging out in a closet waiting for you to call them like a jack in the box and pop up and then go do your bidding for you. So what is this relationship you're developing with them? Same thing with the deities. The deities have invoke Saint Germain. I hear such foolish nonsense like that all the time. If Saint Germain is real, and if he is the kind of unknown superior that we're led to believe he was, he's not going to come to your bidding. This is a man who moved through the courts of Europe, tried to stem revolution, led armies, was involved in some of the great political machinations of the period and secret societies, and of course is said to have been able to create diamonds alchemically. And you're going to drop a dime and call him up on some psychic telephone, and he's going to just pop on over because you want it. Do I need to go any further?
I don't think so.
It's that kind of foolishness that unfortunately dominates too much of the esoteric culture. The same thing with calling on demons. I'm just going to do some Goetia and call up some demon. It's going to do my bidding for me. Good luck with that. Call me on the phone, come to my house, drag me out of bed at 3 a.m, and force me to do something for you, and see how well I respond. And then, the notion of the adepts and the cosmic masters, and there's several essays too on and this Vox Hermes on this view. The folks I've met that we would call adepts, they're not always very nice. I mean, they're polite and everything, but they don't have time for this kind of crap. And they'll make it very clear they don't have time for this nonsense. Don't waste my time. We have this foolish notion that all these guys are masters, are smiling grandfathers. We're going to put up with your bullshit. And they won't. Not in the least. That needs to be clearly understood. You need to bring something to the table if you want their attention. And when I say bring something to the table, I mean a skill set, not hat in hand asking for more handouts. This is not spiritual welfare at that point. They are not going to train you because they like you. They don't like you. These entities do not like you. They do not care about you as a person. That needs to be clearly understood. They care about you only in relationship to your awakening and how that benefits their agenda. And if that agenda is the broader awakening of humanity, well, then you're good. Good for you. You're in a good little place. But one need only look at the history of adepts to realize that the higher forces burn them out in many instances. Not always, but in many. And it doesn't mean that these guys don't have a sense of humor or are just, serious old sods. But don't think for a moment that you're special and that they're going to do your bidding. That's the quickest way to get a big slap on the hand or elsewhere, okay, to help you understand this isn't about what you want when you start talking to them. If you want to talk to them, this is about what you bring to the table. And that puts you that's a whole different level of relationship and obligation. See, what you're talking about is what we say, oh, I want to call on Saint Germain, or I want to call on, okay, heal my kid, heal myself, get me out of debt, very mundane things. Okay, fine. But that's not what they're about. It doesn't mean your prayers may not work, because of course there's other activative potentials involved as well. And it may have nothing to do with that. And maybe, again, there's a certain your faith and confidence in them, which is the key. Agrippa says this again and again. We see this in all of the tantric sadhanas. We see this in all the magical texts. Faith is the key. So if you have complete and utter faith that Saint Germain or Saint Joseph, and of course we're referring to two different names, reasons for saint, or Saint Mary or Saint Michael or any of these will heal you or help you, it's your own inner actualization that is helping to bring that about more so than the entity. Jesus said very clearly, your faith has made you well. And that needs to be distinguished from having a relationship. Do you understand what I'm saying? A personal relationship with these forces. Those are two different things.
Okay, so yeah, those are good points. I think evocation versus developing a relationship or a sort of like attunement or resonation, sort of, maybe, like with the Liturgy of Hermes, is that sort of seen as kind of a practice where you're attuning your consciousness to that archetypal state? And I guess that wouldn't necessarily be considered an invocation in that case, would it?
Well, it's an invocation, it's a prayer, but a petitionary prayer. But you're looking for illumination and you're looking to develop a resonance with that energy. And of course, first and foremost, it's going to be inside of you. First and foremost, the awakening is going to be those archetypal qualities inside your own mind so that you can recognize them and experience them. And then as this ping pong effect, if you want to call it, that goes back and forth, then at some point you may, hopefully, if all goes well, have some kind of awakening or awareness of an aspect of Thoth or Hermes, whatever, that transcends your narrow, limited self. You know,
and I think
that being, which is Thoth, with that being, which is Hermes. But more importantly, what matters most is still in you. That still has to continue with that resonance where you are awakened. Because if you do not make yourself equal to God, how can you know God? It says it very clearly in the text. You are not to be subservient. You're to be an equal. But it's a real equal. You don't just walk into the room and say, hey, I'm your equal. Well, okay, good. It's like a gym. You're weightlifting in a gym. Metal doesn't lie. So they say iron doesn't lie. Same here. There'll be proofs along the way.
And I like the thing you said earlier too about capacity. I think that's a good point. I can see the perspective of different kind of grades or levels of conscious awareness, and that in order to kind of get into a particular alignment, one maybe needs to kind of purify their soul in a way and means to be able to go through a certain particular path in order to evolve themselves to kind of adapt to a more potent sort of exposure. I guess I would say that's kind of what I was getting from what you were saying.
Yes, you have to acclimate yourself to it. And these altered states of awareness don't have the same vibratory frequency. I mean, that's easy to say, but to experience it's a whole other world, quite literally. And the closest thing most people have had to this would be, say, lucid dreaming. You're dreaming. You're dreaming. You become aware that you're dreaming. And then you wake up. Because that transition, that change in frequency within your mind, even though it's small, is just enough where you can't hold on to it. And then you practice, and eventually you're able to hold on to it. And then you're able to function in the lucid dream state. Well, that's just one aspect. That's just the lucid dreaming aspect. Then there's the aspect of what we think of as projection, astral projection, or out-of-body experiences. Again, maintaining that state as it's happening and moving and acting and living in it. And we use the symbols of the planets to represent the stages of ascent, and descent as well. There is a descent prior to the ascent that happened at some point in beginningless time, as far as we understand. And sometime around the Big Bang for most of us. And with that said, with each change in ascent in frequency, there's a change in qualities within us that have to be brought forth. We have to be more resilient and yet more flexible. We have to be able to withstand the pressures. I mean, ultimately, to get what they say in the Hermetica, to get beyond the 8th and the 9th, to get into back to the void, the Ein Sof Or of the Kabbalah, we are to create an awareness that can withstand the awesome creative pressure of the nothingness, of the not. I mean, that's the goal, if you want to call it that.
I recently became familiar with an individual named Raymond Lully, and I don't know a whole lot about him, but I did come across an interesting work that was attributed to him called the Ars Combatoria, and there's some kind of system to reveal truth or something along those lines. But then I also came across an association with a guy named Gottfried Leibniz with that work.
Leibniz.
So
Leibniz. I
maybe
can't comment on that. I know that Lully's system is somehow related to contemporary computer programming and models because of the mathematics involved, but I am in no position to comment on those writings.
Okay. And then what about Raymond Lully himself and any other of his work that you may be familiar with?
I'm in no position to comment on Lully in any informed manner beyond the superficial. Okay. Anything I could say you could find on Wikipedia.
Oh, I could appreciate that. What are your thoughts on the number 666, or that sort of egregore, and what it symbolizes or represents?
Oh, that's a big question. I remember reading some time ago that some folks had looked at the Greek and they said it was really the number should be 888. But within the contemporary framework, not just what I read, I didn't check it, so people can feel free to go look it up. But within the context of your question, 666 is also the number of the spirits of the sun and in magic. But that aside, what we are thinking of is this notion of some kind of gematria or hidden code within the text of the Book of Revelations. And it is referring to a kind of figure that within pop culture and popular thought we think of as the Antichrist. So before something can be anti, it has to be pro. So what is Christ? What does Christ mean? And how can something be anti, can be against it? And if we look at it from, again, one framework, we could see that Christ is the savior of humanity from ignorance. So the Antichrist is that which seeks to keep it in ignorance. On a level, as I said earlier, of descent and ascent, which is continually happening, the force of ascent would be that awakening at Tifereth, that we talked about earlier, the knowledge and conversation of your holy guardian angel, your own personal daemon, as we talked about earlier, your own inner awakening, your force of awakening within yourself, your own experience somehow, conversation or awareness of inner divinity, which is moving you upward, as we call it, on the ascent, on the path of return, to increasing broader and broader potentiality and expression. So, of course, the Antichrist would be that same sphere, Tiferet, that same level, but pushing downward. So it's like two elevators in a building, one going up, one going down, but they're passing the same floor at the same time. So we could think of the Antichrist as that force of counter-initiatic force, which of course is essential. Without something to overcome, again, like the gym, you don't lift weights to lift weights. You lift weights because it makes you strong. And why? Because you want to be healthy. You need opposition, you need resistance for that to take place, for that function to happen. Like you don't do push-ups because you want to try and move the floor. You do it because it gives body weight resistance. Well, the same here. In life, we grow through resistance, through overcoming obstacles. That's why, of course, Satan means the opposer, that which opposes. I think within many contexts, though, if you use the word egregore, so collective ideation around it, that's where we get into a psychic force that in many ways needs to be reconsidered and as much as possible dismantled, because a great deal of it is associated with apocalyptic visionary tendencies. And while there's no ruling those out, the idea that maybe we are fated for them on that level is something we need to readdress. One needs to essentially have their own inner apocalypse, their own inner revelation awakening, rather than have it forced upon them as a collective event.
Do you think that there are individuals or groups out there operating behind the scenes in the world that are trying to force these apocalyptic events upon the masses?
Well, of course there are. We've seen them in history, and they're vocal about it. Many of them are not so hidden. It's part of their stated policy. Let's hurry up and get it over with. Now, whether they're capable of doing that, or whether, I mean, there we move into another area of magic. Of course, there's the whole discussion of what was the role of Enochian magic. You know, and some people have suggested that it was an attempt to bring on the apocalypse. And there may be some truth to that. Despite how other people may use it, you know, what is the original intent? Or at least how did people perceive it? And of course, what was their understanding of the apocalypse and why? Because what would happen at the end is what? You'd have the kingdom of heaven on earth, right? You'd have awakening. The kingdom of heaven. And just so, you know, the listeners know, within the Orthodox Church, which doesn't put a lot of emphasis on the book of Revelations because it's very difficult and discourages reading of it even, within at least the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Antiochian Church, the Mass is seen as a glimpse of heaven. So you could see there where, okay, what is this notion of heaven on earth? That harmony on earth, what is that? And how do we bring that about? And of course, is it something that humanity can initiate on some level? There's many theological questions about that.
Definitely. I like the idea of it. Let's
look at the method. The method is wholesale death and destruction. Two are there and one is gone.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a very efficient method.
Well, it is a very efficient. It's right to the point. Again, as I said earlier, some of these spiritual beings, they have an agenda, and they're not concerned with your well-being in the narrow, limited sense. Either are real, spiritual teachers. You look at spiritual teachers, and everybody wants to be a great practitioner, but you look at who the teachers are for these great practitioners, and they were pretty hard on them. They weren't nice to them. They were hard on them. They were helping them get rid of their inner obstacles to awakening. For us, mostly here and listening to this, we think that we would appreciate that, but the reality is most wouldn't handle it. And there's nothing wrong with saying, that stuff, I need a slower path. That's okay, as long as you're on the path and you're doing something. But be honest about your capacity is what all this boils down to. Be honest about it. And then know when you can have extended periods of practice, of intensity, and then you can lay off. You have a regular rhythm that you can build in. Say, oh, you know what, I've got some time. I can do some intensive work for the next weekend or for the next week or two. Oh, and then I can lay off. I still have my daily practice, but it's like any kind of conditioning you would do for a sport or any other activity. You have periods where you can really go more all in, and periods where you have to lay back and just have your regular natural rhythm.
I think that's a good way to put it. Let's talk about moral teachings veiled in symbolism, also known as Freemasonry. I'm about, I think, 11 chapters or so into your current book, The Path of Freemasonry, and I find that it's very digestible and comprehensive, and an excellent source for anybody interested in esoteric subject matters in general. And morality and ethics seem to be a big focal point within Freemasonry. And there's a very popular book called Morals and Dogma by Albert Pike. And I'm sure you're aware there are individuals out there who propagate the notion that Albert Pike was all these things, a Luciferian, and they'll often create memes misquoting him. They're often misquoted by the words of somebody named Leo Taxel in particular, who was an anti-Mason. Yeah. But I haven't really done super deep dive into Albert Pike and his overall character, so I'm pretty ignorant on this, to be honest, but that's why I'm talking to you. So I wonder if you could give a brief overview of who Albert Pike was as a person and what he really stood for.
Well, Albert Pike is responsible for the regeneration of what we call Scottish Rite in the United States. And he was a Confederate general stationed in Texas as part of the Indian Territories. He was a brilliant scholar for the time. He referenced a great many of the texts of the French occult revival and theosophy as part of his research. So he was deeply involved in that kind of early comparative religious studies. And his immense understanding and learning was presented in one of the books he wrote, which was Morals and Dogma, which is a strange title because it really has very little to do with what we think of as morals or dogma as a teaching, doctrine as a teaching, but it's a strange title. And the book consists of a description or lesson, if you want to call it that, kind of like a lecture paper even, on what each of the degrees is about. There are 32 degrees in Scottish Rite, and there's a 33rd, which is a degree which is given to people of exceptional merit. I know several of my friends received their 33rd this year. It's quite happy for them. In the United States, Scottish Rite has two jurisdictions, Northern and Southern. Northern jurisdiction has, I believe, 15 states involved. Southern jurisdiction has everybody else and a few territories. And it is a spectacular organization with a deep interest in esotericism and all of those things which we've talked about. Because of that, it's very easy to misunderstand Pike or to misquote him. even within Masonic circles. And it is a tremendous debt which we owe him. Masonry, in particular Scottish Rite in North America, would not be the same without him. So we owe a tremendous intellectual and scholarly and cultural debt, and with that spiritual debt to him, because he saw the relationship of all of these ancient, what we kind of broadly call mystery teachings, and saw the relationship to the degrees of Scottish Rite.
In the book, you discuss that there is an effort within Freemasonry that aims at divorcing the craft from its esoteric heritage. And that seems kind of disturbing to me. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's been going on for probably a very long time, primarily in Anglo-Saxon Masonry, and that's probably off and on for centuries. I mean, you figure the United Grand Lodge of England is said to have been established in 1717, and within 30 years, there's complaints about the quality of the craft. So complaining about the quality of the craft seems to be what we do. That aside, in the post-war period, as the doors to American Masonry in particular were thrown wide open, a great many men joined. And those numbers and reasons for joining may not always have been the best. So the organization, which is based on the three legs of philosophy, charity, and fraternity, really focused so much on charity and fraternity that it began to ignore and forget philosophy. And that's to say it's not there, but the degree of learning is not emphasized as it is in, say, other areas, other countries. For example, in the United States, you can become a 32nd degree Mason fairly quickly. If you take a one-day class or a weekend class, you can get it in a weekend, maybe even a day. Now, you don't get all 32 degrees, you get the 4 or 5 key ones. And then the rest you fill in over the next few years, which is in other countries would just be anathema. You would proceed at 1 degree a year. And if you're lucky, maybe after 35 or 40 years in the craft, 50 years, you might be a 32nd. And you would have to work for each degree. It wouldn't just be conferred. There would be activities and learning and responsibilities involved. So that's turning around. We're seeing greater emphasis on philosophy. We're seeing greater emphasis on traditional observance lodges, on quality. And not outrageous, by the way. Just, you know, we're here to be something other than a rod and gun club that wears tuxedos. Yeah.
All right, it's kind of a random question, but what is a Shriner, and how are Shriners connected to Freemasonry?
Shriner is an appendant body. Masonry is a huge tent that has various appendant bodies. And for whatever reason, oh geez, what was the year? Late 19th century, Shriners were created. And they came after Grotto. Grotto was, which I'm a member of, was earlier than the Shrine. And I joined Grotto because a friend of mine insisted I join. And I said, do I get a fez? They said, yes, you get a fez. So I finally joined a Masonic entity with a fez, and I got my own. And their social organization. Now, Grotto has some very interesting rituals. I mean, some really spectacular ones, if they could be done. But again, the emphasis on social activity kind of overshadows a deeper analysis of the environment that is these things are done in, the ritualistic environment. But those entities were specifically formed for social and charitable purposes. Masonry is a tremendously philanthropic organization that I believe in North America gives between $1 and $2 million a day to charity. The Shriners run, I believe the number is 13, it might have been 15 at one point, hospitals free of charge. In fact, they were sued by the insurance companies, forcing them to charge people for treatment. Of course, whether you pay or not may be another story, but think about that. 13 hospitals run state-of-the-art surgery, mostly for burns and children. And there it is. Insurance companies are saying, no, we can't have that. You have to charge these people. That's unfair. It's unfair that you treat them for free. It's unfair to us. So the Shrine raised a tremendous amount of money over the years. One of the principal methods of that fundraising was through the annual circus. Of course, with COVID in the last 3 years, that has not happened. And I know that's cost our local shrine body a tremendous amount of money. And as a result, a tremendous amount of money that would have gone to these hospitals was lost. Not lost, but not raised. It was not raised.
Yeah, that's a really interesting piece of information. I don't think a lot of people have any idea about. That's really, really interesting.
Masonry is an incredibly philanthropic organization on many levels, and the philanthropy is done as all good philanthropy should be done, quietly. We don't tell other people what to do with their money. We do it ourselves. We don't tell you, you need to do this to be a good person. In fact, we say, Masonry makes good men better. We're not a reform school. So we believe in helping people, helping each other, and we do so in a manner that is for the glory of the grand architect of the universe, for the benefit of the people receiving aid, not so that we can turn around and say, look at what we did.
Pretty admirable, if you ask me. I love in your book the parts where you touch on geometry and architecture. I've naturally gravitated towards design, building, architecting things ever since I can remember. I've always had a deep love for beautiful architecture, and the buildings being built these days are just energetically and visibly garbage compared to the old world stone masonry constructions, like with the cathedrals or the temples, and even some of the capitol buildings. But the only kind of thing that comes close these days, I guess, would be like the Mormon or the LDS temples, even though they're pretty beautiful, but I don't think they're still not to that level, probably due to like financial or time constraints. But it really bothers me that there are no modern day projects going on to build in this way, like with the cathedrals or with the good quality stone masonry. Is it just going to be lost forever, or what's your opinion on that?
Well, it's expensive. I remember that President Trump had wanted to, I don't know where it went, but there was some kind of either executive order or something involving the style of government buildings, that they had to be more in tune with that classical style. This dreary poured concrete wasn't going to do anymore. And of course, they're not terrible, but they're hardly attractive. They're hardly inspirational. So, our institutions, we shape them and then they shape us in return. It's a feedback loop. And our architecture, our art, that shapes us and we shape it. It's a feedback loop. And if you want things to be uplifting, then they have to be beautiful. They have to be harmonious. It's going to be very difficult to do that in, a poured concrete structure that has no external facade of design or anything about it. If it just poured concrete with some paint on it, it's functional, and that's fine, but functionality does not inspire. It just inspires more functionality. Art and design, well done, well executed with harmony, they inspire visions of greatness and potential.
Absolutely. All right, well, kind of pushing it on time, so I've got a couple more questions I'll ask you before we sign off. I wanted to definitely touch on the Invisible College. What was the Invisible College? How and why was it originally formed, and what was its function?
Well, when I think of the Invisible College, I think mostly of the Rosicrucian movement. And with that, we see connected to that is the School of the Night. I think they may more or less be the same thing at a certain point. The School of the Night was a gathering of intellectuals that took place in Elizabethan England. And of course, it was at night they gathered and exchange ideas and information, which at that time would have included possibility of alchemy and Kabbalah and various other metaphysical notions too. But the Invisible College, as an expression of Rosicrucianism, has at least two meanings. And one of them is a metaphysical one. That is, the College of the Holy Spirit, the House of the Holy Spirit, is not of this world. It is a astral focal point. It is an invisible college. It's an invisible gathering. And like a college, you have to be admitted to it. And that admission is based upon your effort and awakening. That would mean then that the Rose Croix or the Rosicrucians is a state of awareness. And generally speaking, again, others may have other views too, we call this that awakening at Tifereth in Kabbalah speak. Now, it can have other meanings as well, a whole host of unknown superiors, as sometimes they're called, or invisible brethren. Sometimes cosmic masters is a common term used for the last 120, 130 years. But I think within our context, it really is specific to Rosicrucianism on some level. Now we see the term used again by Jacques Vallée and his group of UFO researchers. And he was aware of the esoteric implications of it. When you read his writings, he clearly knew. So that part is there. The other part is that the college is invisible on the physical sense too, that even if you were to meet one of these adepts, as we've kind of talked briefly about earlier, how would you recognize them? They'd be invisible to you. And the Rosicrucian manifestos say that while they wore no outer sign, they knew each other upon meeting. There was an ability to recognize one another while they wore no outer sign. Some have suggested that meant a gesture, but would you be walking around all day doing the same gesture to everyone? I think it's more realistic given the context to suggest it was a psychic or clairvoyant perception.
Fascinating. The Ark of the Covenant, I read in your book, was said to have contained the broken fragments of the Ten Commandments. Is there some historical evidence or documentation that exists to support that claim? Or where was that information derived from?
Well, that's from the Bible. That's from the Old Testament. As far as support, no, because that would mean that we have them, and unless they're in a box, in a crate somewhere in a giant warehouse outside of Washington, D.C., as the movie suggests, I mean, it's part of the mythology, the stories.
So do you have a minute to touch on Enochian magic and that system and a little bit more of the background with that?
Enochian magic, of course, was a system of revealed magic to John Dee and one of his scryers, Edward Kelly, over a series of years, in which through crystal gazing and black mirrors and shoe stones of all sorts, Kelly revealed, or was revealed by angels, a series of tablets. And these tablets had squares on them and grids, and they had letters in them, which were revived over time, that were said to contain the language of the angels. And of course, it was called Enochian because Enoch walked with God and was no more. And then, of course, an alphabet called the Enochian alphabet was given to it, but really the original Enochian alphabet is the English alphabet. You know, one of the funnier aspects of it is how you see a lot of Enochian magicians referring to a Zed or Zod, and that's just the way they say Z. We say Z, the British say Zed. So you have all these people thinking Zed is Enochian when all it means is Z. Now, these tablets, of course, as we call them, were 5 in number, 4 large ones, 1 small central one. And a series of names could be derived from them. And with them were also a series of, we could call them prayers, although they're not really prayers, they're more statements, revelatory statements that constitute the Enochian corpus. And these are incredibly apocalyptic and violent in nature. When one reads them, visionary, they're quite spectacular. And there are many aspects to Enochian magic. There's other aspects too. There's a fairly large system that hasn't been fully explored. But became very popular with Aleister Crowley. And Israel Regardie, wrongly so, saw it as the capstone of the Golden Dawn system. You know, it isn't. It was just part of it. But of course, because of that, many people only having access to Crowley's works for decades have come to believe it as being that. It's been adopted by other organizations too. The Church of Satan issued its own variation of some of the Enochian stuff. And many other groups have done extensive work with it. Order of the Cubic Stone did some great work with it, as did some other orders. But it's a tricky system, and you have conflicting views about it. As with anything, I say advance with caution. Don't rush in where angels fear to tread, particularly when those angels, they're not nice. Now, I'm not going to say they're terrible, but I have not found them to be warm and fuzzy. I found the Enochian entities to be aloof and cool. They're creatures of air, for lack of a better descriptor. They're very aloof. But that also means, because the vocalization aspect is air, as we call it. Vocalization is how you do this. It's through recitation, how they're called. And this also has an effect on your own aerial structures, that is your nervous system. So some people suggest that it's a very easy system to use and very efficient. Others would disagree. I think that it's up to you to figure it out. We did publish a monograph on how to study Enochian magic. And, you know, I did it the old-fashioned way, meaning I did it straight out of what we understood the 14 days or 18. See, it's not clear. Is it 14 or 18? I had the golden ring made, real ring, not paper imitation, as some suggest, or just visualizing it on my finger. We did the implements, did it. And I found that it was very interesting and very worthwhile, but the experiences were very clear and precise. But when I look back at it, and I look forward to, if I were to do more of it again, under what causes and conditions that would be, I have to say the entities will not tolerate your stupidity. That was just my experience with it. They were very cool and aloof.
All right, this will be all right. What entities, beings, forces, rituals, practices, systems have you found are most beneficial in terms of development and ascent or evolution of the soul in general, would you say?
Well, your own self-awareness. We're talking about the expansion of your knowledge of self, your self-realization, and then bringing that forth. And I found that, the Liturgy of Hermes is a fantastic foundationary practice, because a devotional practice is very important. And you have to have a good practice that understands the nature of your own mind. So if you're jumping into ritual and going to do, this kind of heroic ritual work every day, where it's an hour and a half to 2 hours of ritual, and you're going to burn yourself out. You're going to super saturate, because magic is inherently destabilizing. That's its nature, is to destabilize, because you got to shake things up before you can reorganize them. Yeah.
Makes sense.
It's like, okay, I'm going to banish. Okay, what do you think you're getting rid of when you do all this banishing? And so you have to take your time and be patient if you're going to undertake a ritual path. And devotion, you have to really have trust and confidence in your capacity, but that also means a generosity, a compassion for yourself and for others, and not a foolish compassion, not idiot compassion, but one where you understand that if you start thinking of yourself as these magical ideas, these magical names, and you're posting pictures of yourself online in your ritual robes and in your alchemical practices. I mean, there's a few people I know who do that, who I trust and I respect, but I've known them for years. But all of this stuff, too quickly and too easily, if you're constantly mentioning your dreams and so-called psychic experiences on social media, or even talking about them with friends, you're so far from moving anywhere healthy that you need to stop all that immediately. That's not for public consumption. None of that's for public consumption. That's for your own awakening. So esotericism or your magical practices can't be a substitute for having a life. They have to help you become more complete and more full, but they're not a substitute for paying your bills. If you don't want to have a lot of bills, then don't get a lot of stuff. I mean, that's the choice, or make other decisions, but make good decisions, because in life, and magic is life on steroids, so to speak, good decisions multiply and bad decisions multiply. They just tend to do it quickly. Because good decisions are harmonious for us. Bad decisions are disharmonious for us. And when they multiply quickly, that disruption multiplies. So when we're undertaking these ritual paths, and again, is your path to become more or to have more? And a lot of the way magic is approached today is kind of a have more thing. And of course, there's some things you do need. You need, your fundamentals in terms of income and health, and a place to live and food and all of that. However, within that context, once you've established that, what is the purpose of your practice? And it has to be to become more, so that what is that more? This is where we talked about the philosophical foundation, so that you have the capacity, you have a structure, a mental personality and beingness and awareness that is stable enough and strong enough to survive the awesome pressures of the void, of the not from which we have come. Because that is where you're going, in theory.
Alrighty then. Do you have any last messages or thoughts that you want to put out there before we put out how people can find you? Any last thoughts?
Just have a daily practice and patience. This is not a a race. Patience.
I heard that was a virtue.
It is. Because when you rush things, that's when things explode in the lab. That's when things go wrong. Just be patient and be kind to yourself. Don't be lazy. Be honest. Be hard on yourself when you need to be, but not excessive. And focus on your own awakening and being useful there. Your best use to humanity is to be more alert, more awake, more enlightened, more illuminated. You don't have to worry about anything. Don't worry about good and evil, right and wrong. Ask yourself, am I leaving the world a more beautiful place? If you can work with that, it makes things easier for you. Is what I'm doing right now helpful to my journey? Is this helpful to my path? Get rid of those things which eat away at your time, that waste your life. Get rid of all of those things. Useless time on social media, useless time YouTube surfing, useless time gossiping. And watch your language, watch your attitude. Stay positive and optimistic, not foolishly so, but that you can handle whatever comes your way. You can solve whatever problems comes your way. Learn how to be imperturbable, as they say. This too shall pass. You have goals and focus on them, and then a lot of other things will fall in line for you. And choose your friends carefully. You'll be like the 5 people you spend the most time with. So choose your friends very, very carefully. Ask yourself, do I want to be like this person? I don't want to be like them. Why am I spending time with them? Even at parties, on the few that I go to, I'll be polite to everyone, but I won't spend time with people I don't want to talk to. Because from these events, you have your own experiences where some people are kind and helpful and generous, or maybe have a good story, but the regulars who just want to come over and complain about stuff. No time for that. You have a limited time here on earth. Use it wisely.
Be imperturbable. I love that. Great. Well, this was awesome. Where would you like to direct people if they wanted to learn more about you and anything that you're up to?
Well, the best place is they can find our blog at Vox Hermes. They can just type that in, Vox Hermes, and that'll come up on Google. But go to Teachable and sign up for our courses there. That's really the best thing. And again, Unfolding the Rose, it's 6 hours of coursework. We just added additional material to it. So it's not 6 hours. It's a lot more than that if you go into the curriculum section and start looking at the additional audio programs and portions of programs and papers that we've posted there. I mean, it's a great deal of information, and it's all at no cost to you. And then we have other courses too, but that's a great place to start. There's so much there. So we encourage everyone to go there. Institute for Hermetic Studies at teachable.com.
Excellent. All right. Well, once again, I appreciate you and I appreciate your time. So thank you once again, and have a good night.
Thank you very much. It was great to be here.